Tea time.
Welcome everybody! Souldin of the Grin Brothers here, and it's time for another episode of Tea Time. Now then, the Christmas calendar teas are still continuing. As such, there is a new tea time to correspond with the Christmas calendar tea I'm having. So, from the brand of Darvilles of Windsor comes Sencha Leaf, a green tea. Brew time is 1 to 4 minutes, and the information on it, I had to again look up because my tea calendar doesn't provide it. A tea very popular in ancient China and Japan. One name translates to steamed. It is a very light and fresh tea with a subtle sweetness and a slightly savoury smoothness. It smells quite delicious, though also quite strong at the same time. So it'll be interesting to see how things go with this tea. Admittedly, with strong green teas, they tend to taste better, or well, less overpowering and overwhelming once they start to cool down. If you have them hot, though, they are pretty darn powerful. It doesn't help that I don't really have a thermometer to really check the temperature of the teas, because you're not supposed to use it as boiling temperature of a green tea, unlike with black teas where you can kind of, 1 minute of letting the kettle rest for a bit and then whoop, in goes the water. But green teas you have to wait a bit longer, and I'm not sure I really did that. But I've brewed it for 2 minutes. Yeah, 2 minutes I brewed it for. Maybe a few seconds over that, but in any case, for today's tea time, it's actually been a pretty difficult one because I have no idea whether I've done this tea time or not. Yeah, it's funny. There was another tea time I've done for the Christmas calendar set where it's like, this is a tea time a topic I thought of long ago, and I'm not sure if I've actually done it. In fact, it's been in this little notebook I had with me for ages. Like, it's at least a year old now, this subject I have in mind. And I've got these old notes, and some of them I'm not even sure they properly apply. In any case, I've got these old notes, and I figured, you know what, I need a quick, simple, easy tea time. I've been busy with all the Christmas stuff. I've finished wrapping all the presents and such. So, yeah, here's a quick tea time. It's easy to do because I literally have it all written down here. Just old information, which might not be quite how I feel nowadays, but hey, I'll mention that if that's the case. But this tea time is Top 6 Systems I'd Like to Own. Cue snappier title. And basically, whilst I am mostly focused in collecting games of, the current gens, as well as, and more specifically collecting Nintendo Wii games, there are various video game systems that I do not own that, I look back on and think, man, I'd really like to own those. Now, of course, this extends far beyond the number 6. However, I figured I'd limit it down to 6 systems. So I'll start with a few special mentions that I haven't got, and some may actually, if I were to redo this list, might actually swap one with some of these ones in the special mentions here. So special mentions, I'd say the Commodore 64. I am a big fan of the Amiga systems and do own an Amiga 1200, so I've got some nostalgia there, and it'd be interesting to go back and see what the predecessor to the Amiga was like. I do own a C64 Mini, so I'll be able to play Commodore games soon enough, but I just need the adapter to be able to properly work it on the TV and everything, but I didn't really feel like opening it otherwise. The Watara Supervision is a nifty little device in that it is actually a system which thought, we're going to actually compete with the Game Boy by doing the Game Boy strategy, but even cheaper. And honestly, it was an admirable attempt. It wasn't just blatantly trying to copy the Game Boy here and there sort of thing. They actually had some pretty cool ideas, like a little rubber neck thing to, so you could have it as like a tabletop sort of system. And it could apparently plug into the TV. So it's apparently not too great of a system, suffers a lot from ghosting, but I appreciate the effort they put into the Watara Supervision in trying to compete with the Game Boy as a budget black and white, no colour system. Let's see, other systems that tickle my fancy. The Sega Game Gear, on the basis that I actually own a Game Gear game. Yeah, I own a Game Gear game, but no Game Gear. And I actually have memories of wanting to play on the Game Gear, but my cousin not letting me, because she owned one. So yeah, there's a bit of attachment there, but there's a reason why I haven't got the Game Gear in this top 6 list. And the other one is the classic Xbox, the only 6th gen system I don't own, to my knowledge. I think, if we could, 6th gen console that I don't own. And, I've just come to really appreciate the Microsoft lineup and the fact that at that point, the Microsoft Xbox Studios and had a ton of effort put into creating original titles and trying to get franchises off the ground. And there's a lot of exclusive games on the Xbox which never transferred. That may be dissipated somewhat from the fact that Microsoft are really promoting backwards compatibility of their newer systems. But there's still a very limited library of original Xbox games available on the Xbox One via backwards compatibility. It's only like 50. And so, there's plenty of classic Xbox games I look to and think, I'd love to play that. So, but, and the classic Xbox, I'd say, was probably pretty close to actually going onto this list. So, in any case, let's actually get on to the top 6 systems I'd like to own. Starting off with number 6, the Nokia Engage. Yes, I didn't stir anything. That is an actual thing. It was released in the 6th gen of video game systems. I guess, well, it kind of is the 6th gen handheld. Or the handheld generations are kind of separate from the console generations. But in terms of when the systems were out, this is 6th gen. It was released in October 2003 by Nokia, hence the name Nokia Engage. And it was basically, Nokia were really ahead of the curve, and they decided to make a mobile phone which played games as a primary thing. But it was a cross-blend. It was both a mobile phone and a handheld compared to the Game Boy Advance at the time. It beat the iPhone to the punch by several years, but lacked a lot of the ingenuity of the iPhone, as it were. It didn't have the touchscreen and such. It was still a button-based system. It had a little trouble trying to present itself, and it was using old Nokia sort of screens. So, the sort of vertical orientation of the old Nokia phones. So a lot of games, for instance, like fighting games, weren't exactly well suited to it, and a lot of games weren't very easy to have. Okay, we made this game on the Game Boy Advance, let's also make it on the Nokia, because of course the way it's presented, there's not much horizontal plane, it's mainly vertical. So it was great, I guess if you were going for a scrolling up shooter, but not so much for a lot of the other games or thing. But it's the only time I'll say that I've ever wanted to own a phone, and if I were to ever own a phone nowadays, a Nokia Engage is what I'd go for. That's the only case I'll ever say, I want a phone, I'll own a phone. And given I keep being pestered to start owning a phone to actually be contacted in emergencies, I kind of feel like it would be a good idea to eventually look up and find a Nokia Engage. But I'm a little confused about the whole SIM card process and such. In any case, games I would like to try on the Nokia Engage include Bomberman, because I'm a fan of Bomberman. Sonic N, it's apparently basically just Sonic Advance, but on the Nokia Engage, so it's probably not as good, but that still means you can play Sonic Advance on another system, which is really cool. And Pandemonium, a sort of game where you play these two jesters in a platforming game, which I remember fond memories of playing a demo disc on the PlayStation. And so I'd really like to actually see what it was like to be able to play it again and play the full version, albeit on the Nokia Engage. The Nokia Engage apparently actually had a really impressive Tomb Raider port on it as well. The only problem being that the Nokia Engage's palette was apparently a lot weaker, so there wasn't as many shades of brown, for instance, to depict it. But it could run 32-bit games well enough. There's also a King of Fighters game, and I'm a fan of fighting games, and I've been getting a bit more into SNK, as it were, so I wouldn't mind actually trying that as well. So there's a lot that appeals to me with the Nokia Engage. Fifth is the reason why I didn't put the Game Gear on the list, and that is the Master System by Sega, a third-generation console released in October of 1985 by Sega. And, well, the reason why I say there's no reason for me to own a Game Gear with the Master System is because I'm coming from the UK. The Master System did not do well in Japan. It did not do well in America. But in UK, Europe, and Brazil, woo! The Master System was amazingly popular, and there's tons of games only available for the Master System in those regions. Like the last Master System game was released in like America and Japan was like 1991. The last Master System game released elsewhere, like 1996. It went on for ages, and heck, in terms of Brazil, they actually started making some original games for it as well, and they still get the sales going up. I've heard it's more of a collector's item. They make collector's model of variations of it. But yeah, the Master System always looks really nice. The controller looks pretty cool. And the fact that it has such a UK heritage to it, despite not actually coming from the UK, but because it's got so many sort of games that, are exclusive to the UK and, my part, it feels like I'd be able to connect with a pretty important part of UK gaming history via it. And so that's why I'm quite interested in a Master System. And, even my history teacher would talk big about her love for the Master System and Alex Kidd and all stuff like that. So it's, it's interesting, when you talk to like Americans, they'll sort of talk about the nostalgia gaming, when they talk about a video game system, they'll often bring up the NES. In the UK and such, if it was a console, because again, home computers are really popular, like Commodore 64 is the expectation. When it was, in terms of a console though, it was often the Master System. And games I'd like to own on it, Fantasy Zone, often dubbed with Oppa Oppa as effectively the original mascot. It was original mascot to Sega. There was like Oppa Oppa was like the first mascot. I believe that was linking part into the arcade experience. Then there was of course Alex Kidd, and then eventually it led into Sonic. But it's a cute 'em up, sort of like a very cutesy shoot 'em up sort of game. Looks very charming. Still looks beautiful graphically today. And I'd really like to be able to get my hands on it and try it out. There's also Psychic World. It was like a Game Gear launch title, and of course, the UK region is the only one it got a Master System port as well in the UK and Europe and such. Unlike in America and Japan, it was purely Game Gear exclusive there. Not so the case with the UK. And I do personally prefer consoles over handhelds, and it looks really adorable. Sort of running, scrolling, shooter, platformer sort of thing, and really charming anime cutscenes and charming box art. So, well, particularly the Japanese version sort of thing. So I'm quite interested in Psychic World, and then Phantasy Star, which I have played a little bit of, and it's actually really interesting. Female lead character pretty early on. Actually, a pretty cool JRPG, although you require a lot of grinding at the early on. It might be more sensible to just get the Nintendo Switch version, which has a lot of improvements sort of thing. But you know what? If I was going to out of my way to own a nostalgic console, an old system, I'd want the cartridge games as well that I'm interested in. Phantasy Star is definitely one of those. I had a fantastic time with Phantasy Star 4. Absolutely amazing game. And Phantasy Star looks quite appealing, and whilst of course rough from age, I think I'd appreciate it quite a bit if I were to own a Master System. Number 4, and this one I actually have some fond childhood memories of from playing at one of my cousin's houses. It's quite a few times. The Vectrex, a second-gen console released November 1982 by Western Technologies / Smith Engineering. The Vectrex was probably the most unique second-generation console of all. It was vector-based graphics, so it had no natural colour. You had to use the colour by on-screen sort of thing. And the vectors meant that you couldn't fill in the shapes really, per se. But the graphics were out of this world sort of thing. It was so ahead of its time in terms of the graphics capabilities of sort of 3D displays and such. It would look like an arcade game. You may have seen the sort of vector-based graphics of the Vector Star Wars games, being sort of people showcasing in the olden days of, these are amazing, or look at them graphics sort of thing. And the Vectrex just looked stunning. And, it was also its own screen and everything, so you didn't need a TV sort of thing. So it seemed a real sensible idea. It's built its own screen so you can play it without the TV. It's effectively a very, very heavy, giant portable system. Comes naturally with 2 controllers, I believe. And I recall having a lot of fun times with it. I can't remember all the games I played. Definitely played the built-in Mindstorm on it. Basically a built-in Asteroid game. If you didn't have a game cartridge, you just turn it on and you would start playing Mindstorm, which was basically an Asteroids clone. And, and I have a lot of fond memories of it, sort of playing it. Of course, it's pre-dated, but any game system from the second generation is going to be. And I still think it's impressive what they did back then. Sadly, it came out basically at the tail end of the American video game crash, and so it never really got a chance to take off. But my gosh, it looked lovely. And originally, they were making it as a handheld system, as in a proper one, sort of portable system. Wasn't a giant TV, as it were. So it would have been interesting if they made a Vectrex 2, which, had they prospered, where they actually realised their original handheld ambitions. In any case, games I'd like to own on the Vectrex. Mindstorm is built in, but they actually made a sequel to it, which was more so a fixed version with a couple sort of enhancements and a few extra levels called Mindstorm 2. And as a big fan of Asteroid games, and particularly of the Mindstorm I played on the Vectrex, that's a game I'd love to own. Spike is to my knowledge, the only sort of platforming mascot-esque character on the Vectrex, and it's really impressive how they did a platformer with vector-based graphics and digitized voicing. Again, this was 1982. It was pretty incredible technology at the time, and it looks like a lot of fun how they managed to do it. It kind of looks like a sort of odd-angled Donkey Kong, as it were. You're going up and down the sort of ladders and such, or I guess Lode Runner and stuff like that. You're going up and down the ladders and all that, and but the angle is somewhat 3D. Sort of like a diagonal-looking angle to it all, to give a field of depth to it, which is really cool. And then there's Spinball, as it would be known in America, but as elsewhere is known as Flipper Pinball. And that's because it's a pinball game, and despite how I don't bring it up too often, I actually really like pinball, particularly pinball video games sort of thing. It's one of those small gaming things I don't bring up too often. I don't go out of my way, but pinball section video games and just pinball games, I tend to actually really like them when I actually decide to play them. But yeah, the Vectrex. It's the oldest system I don't have an interest in, and I have had past experience with it. So yeah, definitely a system I'd love to own. Number 3 is from the 5th generation of video game systems, the Sega Saturn. It's, as I just said, a 5th generation console released in November 1994 by Sega. And there are a ton of games. I've ended up seeing a lot of videos and a lot of games about the Sega Saturn. So the list of games I'd like to play on the system goes on forever. But the Sega Saturn just feels like a missing piece to me. And I've experienced the PlayStation, I've experienced the N64. But, I've seen the Sega Mega Drive and the Sega Dreamcast, but I've missed that system in between. I didn't even know about it, and I was in the UK where Sega were pretty popular. And, yeah, I completely didn't know that it came out. There was questions of like, man, why didn't Sega release a 5th gen system? Well, they did. It was the Sega Saturn. It just never took off overseas. It took off wonderfully in Japan, but never really overseas. And yet there's a lot of really cool exclusives on the Sega Saturn, particularly if you look to the Japanese import where it got so many more games. I think it's like up to 1,000 games, whereas like overseas it only got 280 at most, I think. And there's a lot of really good 2D games. The Sega Saturn was a 2D powerhouse. And, even the 3D games, whilst they were clearly harder to develop for, the ones coming out from Sega, like Burning Rangers and Knights, do look fantastic. And they look like the effort's been put in to really take advantage of the system and do things that it wasn't necessarily designed for, but could do with the time and dedication. It's got stuff like the House of the Dead games, which I'd love to play. And let's see a few games to mention. I did think about mentioning Princess Crown, basically the game that Vanillaware made before they were Vanillaware, and I believe they were part of Atlas at the time, and they left to become Vanillaware. But that's Japanese only, so I wouldn't understand a word of it. But games I did like the look of, Guardian Heroes, Beat 'em Up by Treasure, sort of with RPG elements, looks fantastic. I'd love to actually play that. Apparently it's available as download now, but I don't want to experience on the proper Sega Saturn, Croc Legend of the Gobbos, I loved Croc 2, and I'd love to be able to play it on the Sega Saturn. And from what I hear, Croc Legend of the Gobbos, as well as the original Tomb Raider, their original systems they were designed for was actually the Sega Saturn, not the PlayStation. So, I'd be interested to play the system they were intended for. And the other one is Deep Fear, a Resident Evil-styled game on a submarine. And the reason why this one is of particular interest, even though it's not really a game I naturally think of, aside from the fact that I've been getting more into horror games thanks to Project Zero and Little Nightmares and such, is it's the last game that was released overseas, specifically in the PAL regions, released in November 1998. And then Sega Saturn took like a whole year off, but it was the last Sega Saturn game, aside from a translation of Magic Knight Rayearth, but I'm not even sure if that came out in PAL territories. So it has a lot of importance, as it were. And from what I hear, it's actually a really good game, so I'd be interested in actually playing that. Number 2, then! A system I could have almost owned. But Rafi didn't phone me up to tell me, should I buy this? I was like, yes, you should have bought it. I could have owned one. But he didn't, and it was gone like the next day. The Geo Pocket Color. I guess it's technically a 6th gen handheld. It did release around the time of the Dreamcast. Released March 1999 by SNK. Let's see. Well, for starters, it has a connection with the Dreamcast. There are games which connect between the Neo Geo Pocket Color and the Dreamcast. And the Dreamcast was my first console of my own. So there's a lot of importance and merit there. And aside from the Nintendo Wii, if I was to collect for another system, I'd probably be collecting games for the Sega Dreamcast, because of that factor that it's my first video game console. And so having the Neo Geo Pocket Color as a companion system to it would also be pretty great. But there's of course lots of reasons the Neo Geo Pocket Color interests me in and of itself. Its unique control sticks or joysticks or thing. The graphics and games on it look wonderful. And it'd be interesting seeing a gaming system that wasn't Nintendo, effectively. Handheld gaming system wasn't Nintendo, and tried to compete with Nintendo when Nintendo was in its prime with Pokemon release. And again, I love fighting games, and it's a handheld system which apparently does fighting games really well, which is hard to imagine because handheld and fighting games aren't exactly, one-to-one. But games that interest me on it, well, we've been, at the time of this recording, we've been uploading the SNK Heroines playthrough, so you know that I have an interest in that before, and the reason I have an interest in that is because I had an interest in SNK Gal Fighters, and if I owned a Neo Geo Pocket Color, that'd be definitely a game I'd want to own. The chibi sprites look wonderful, the fighting mechanics look smooth, and the endings look hilarious, except for Shiki's, which is depressing. Evolution Eternal Dungeon, probably a hard one to track down, but it was a turn-based RPG which released both on the Neo Geo Pocket Color and the Sega Dreamcast, and I believe there's some interconnectivity between the two. But of course, I liked my turn-based RPGs as well as my fires, and to my knowledge, it was the only purely turn-based RPG. The other RPGs, there were a couple, were... Actually, I believe there was like a robot one, which is kind of like Pokemon, but with robots. And not Robopon, a different one. And the other ones were mostly SRPG-styled games. But Evolution Eternal Dungeon was a traditional JRPG sort of affair, Final Fantasy-esque of style. And I'd be interested in that again because it's got a Dreamcast version as well to be able to compare the two and play both of them. And there's Con Fantastic Night Dreams because I like witches and I've been curious about trying to get into shoot-em-ups. And again, I mentioned before about Fantasy Zone. Con Fantastic Night Dreams is definitely a cute-em-up because it looks adorable. And that would definitely be a system. You know, I say about the praise about the Geo Pocket Color and its fighting games. I mentioned only one fighting game, but that's kind of because the non-fighting games are so rare that they have more appeal to them. I'd probably be able to pick up many of the fighting games on it. Basically, I've seen most of the games on the Geo Pocket Color look like I'd like to play that. Okay, before I mention my number one, and I shall try out this Sencha tea. Still a bit hot. Still a bit strong. No, actually not strong, actually. Yeah, it's not actually that strong. It's actually a pretty mild taste, but pretty even. It's actually spreading across the mouth pretty well. The flavour... It's a very tame flavour, but it spreads well. It's lasting a decent time. But it's so slight. Very, I guess you'd say, inoffensive tea. The thing is, its smell is a lot stronger than its taste. It's a kind of a little bit of a surprising. It might actually be a pretty good starter tea. Or then again, it could be the fact that I had the water too hot and I only brewed it for 2 minutes. Maybe it'd be stronger with 4 minutes, but... Yeah, based off the taste of, my impression of this particular one, it might actually be a really good starter green tea to start out with. For those who are wanting to try out green tea and, to prepare themselves for the fact that a lot of the other green teas are a lot more bitter. There is a soothing quality to it, definitely. Not sure. It is slightly different flavour than the usual green tea. That might be the savoury part of it. I'm not sure I'd quite describe it as savoury, but I guess it's an apt description. It's definitely not sweet, and it's not entirely bitter. The flavour actually goes all the way to the sides of the tongue. It actually travels pretty well. It's quite nice. But again, very toned down, particularly compared to its smell. It's strong smelling, but in any case, that's my thoughts on the Sencha green tea. And now the number one system I'd like to own, an Amiga CD 32, which you've probably never heard of. It's a 5th gen console released September 1993 by Commodore International, and is of Commodore International itself, basically the last system they ever got to make. I believe one of the systems they made was one that they ended up, I believe, releasing a system after they perished, which was basically a system they'd been working on, and the company who bought them out released the system afterwards. They'd been working on a Amiga 4000T, which was like an Amiga 12,000 souped up, but with a tower, effectively, for business purposes. But it could also be used for gaming, to my knowledge, and, was a bit more powerful, but, again, because it had a tower. But the Amiga CD 32 was basically Commodore's last stand. It was actually a pretty good attempt, and if you're not counting the FM Towns Marty, which was released only in Japan, at least in terms of PAL shores, the CD32 was the first fifth generation console. But again, you got the situation where it's actually kind of funny. In the 5th generation, there's a different starting console for each sort of territory of Japan, of like the Japan, PAL, and NSTC. Whereas in America, for instance, the 3DO was the first of the 5th gen. In Japan, it was the FM Towns Marty, and then in PAL regions, it was the CD32. The CD32 has a fascinating history to it and a lot of potential, I felt, to it. They had a really cool idea of converting the Amiga 1200 into a console to allow for a lot of the older games to be ported to it, as well as adding an exclusive chip to it to be able to give it some unique edge. But unfortunately, Commodore were too bankrupt at the time to effectively get it to last as long and to live up to its potential, so it only lasted 7 months. It had potential to be upgraded, had a good little marketing push to it, and of course, because of its nature, it ended up actually with a lot of games in its short lifetime. It had over 100 games easily. Unfortunately, not all of them are all that good because the basis for it was, we'll just quickly port over old Amiga games, throw in some cutscenes and an improved soundtrack, and that's it. Rather than actually taking advantage of the fact that it was a 32-bit system and its unique chip they had added to it. I think it's the Akiko. In any case, though, again, that sort of concept was more of a future-proof thing that when the Amiga CD32 started doing well, which it was actually the sort of best-selling CD-based console of 1993 within the UK, and it had a sort of, by the time it's demise, it had over 60% of the market share of CD-based systems. Of course, its competition was only like Philips CDI, Mega CD, and stuff like that, but still, that's impressive nonetheless. It had promise, it had potential. And the fact they had upgrade sort of expansion ports where it could be upgraded. Maybe it would have struggled pretty quickly against the PlayStation and Sega Saturn's mightier power, but still, it was a pretty good last effort, and it had, they had some foresight with it. But unfortunately, it was more of a victim of all of the past problems of Commodore, the lack of research and development, sort of funding and stuff like that. But it's still a system that appeals to me, particularly in the fact that I like the Amiga 1200, but I'm not particularly a, home computers gamer per se. I'm much more into my consoles. And so to be able to play that, but in a console form, would be mind-blowing. And of course, games I would like to play on it. Zool was being effectively pitched, Commodore, from what I hear of the rumours, Commodore wanted Zool to be the pack-in title, Zool 2, the sequel, to be the pack-in title for the Amiga CD32, and they kind of wanted to embrace him as kind of a mascot, but not fully, because they were technically a computer company, and mascots weren't seen as the computer thing to do. But in terms of their console, they wanted Zool to be a front runner for it. And he's a cool little gremlin ninja from the Nth Dimension, alien ninja. Real cool design, kind of a Sonic X sort of speed to his platforming, but he's also got like a little shooting attack sort of thing. So heck, his first level was a sponsorship with like Chuppa Candy, so looked really cool. And I like my platformers, and I like the fact that this was effectively, in a way, the unofficial mascot of the Amiga CD32, much like how Gex is the unofficial mascot to the 3DO and stuff like that. And as I mentioned in the mascot video, Banshee is a game by Core Design who would make Tomb Raider, and it's a shoot 'em up, which is apparently pretty tough, pretty short, only 4 levels, but it's bonkers. It's like aliens invade during the steampunk era, and like the guy refused to make him like, I think it's like the toaster, and so they kill him, and so his son goes to avenge his inventor father, and he's like like steampunk plane taking out aliens, and it looks amazing, it sounds amazing, and it was mostly marketed as a CD32 game, although it did also apparently release on, I believe, the Amiga 1200. But because it was mainly pitched as a CD32 with mainly CD32 copies printed, it fell into obscurity. But here it's really good, and its story sounds great. And then, of course, the other game I'd like to own on the CD32 is Fury of the Furries, because I absolutely love Fury of the Furries, and to be able to play Fury of the Furries with not having to do any of the disc swapping and on a console would be a dream come true. That would be so wonderful to do. And there you have it, the top 6 systems I'd like to own. Admittedly, again, I'm probably unlikely to, because I have limited space, because I don't own my own house, and as much as I brag about my money due to the fact I don't have friends to spend it on, it's still a case of I probably shouldn't just be spreading myself so thin. I should probably dedicate myself to the systems I do own. But hey, maybe I'll own one of these someday. And they're definitely the ones I'd be most interested in obtaining. For now, though, the Wii's my focus, maybe dipping into the Dreamcast. But the Wii is the big focus, of course, because that's what I can record that and have plans for that. And, of course, the other ones which are of a focus are, of course, the current-gen systems, which I can do recording of, maybe newer systems like the Xbox Series X, which, again, can do recording of for the Grin Brothers channel. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this tea time. Feel free to share with me your thoughts on this tea time, my thoughts on the systems, what systems I want to own, and feel free to share with me what video game systems you don't own, but you'd love to own, you'd love to experience, you'd love to try out, and you think, oh man, there's lots of games on this that I really like, and I'd like to own it, to play the games, or even collect for it. In any case, I hope you enjoyed, and cheerio!